In this video, I'll be discussing equilibrium and the adjustment process. In previous videos, we've talked about a relationship that exists between prices and quantities. First, we introduced our demand curve, which is the relationship between our price and our quantity demanded. Recall that the law of demand states that as prices increase, quantity demanded goes down. So therefore, we will have an inverse relationship between prices and quantity, which will give us a downward sloping demand curve. And we also discussed our supply curve, which is the relationship between price and quantity supplied. And this law of supply states that as prices increase, quantity supplied increases as well. So now we're going to be putting both of these concepts together on the same graph and looking at how we actually establish what we consider to be the market price and the market quantity. So if you look at this graph, you'll see that both of our figures are now on the same graphic representation. Again, price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. And our equilibrium is going to occur where our quantity demanded is equal to our quantity supplied. So I've labeled this on our graph as P star and Q star, and we refer to P star as the market price. And when we're in equilibrium, what we view prices at is a market signal. So our market and our buyers and our sellers are actually going to go through this adjustment process, and competition is going to drive us towards these equilibrium prices. Now, at equilibrium, we maximize our consumer surplus and our producer surplus. And remember, this is the benefit to both of our traders of their gains from the exchange. So recall that our consumer surplus is everything above the market price and below the demand curve. So this is our consumers' benefit from the gain from exchange. Whereas our producers are going to be on this bottom section here, everything above our supply curve, otherwise known as a cost curve, and below our market price. So anytime we're at the left-hand side of this equilibrium point where our quantity demanded is greater than our quantity supplied, these are mutually beneficial trades that should be occurring and that are good for the economy. Now, the question that we want to ask ourselves is, how do we arrive at this point? And what happens if at first we price either above or below our equilibrium point? So we'll start by taking a look at what happens if we accidentally have a price below equilibrium. If we have a price below equilibrium, we will be lower than our market price. And what we're going to see here is we're going to see a difference between our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied. So we'll call this P subscript B for price below. And we read this graph horizontally and vertically. So as we go, we want to take a look at where this crosses our demand and our supply curves. So at this price below equilibrium, we draw this where it intersects our supply curve and drop it down. That's going to give us our quantity supplied. And over here, we're going to drop this down from our demand curve. And we're going to wind up with our quantity demanded. Now, what this is going to create is this is going to create a difference between what consumers want and what producers want to provide. So this is going to be a problem, and the market is actually going to signal via prices how we compete those prices back up. So what this creates when we have this difference, first thing we have is a quantity demanded that is greater than our quantity supplied. This is going to lead to a shortage. The value of our shortage is going to be the difference between our quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So a price below equilibrium is going to entice consumers. Consumers like lower prices. So it's going to entice consumers to come into this market and to try and get as much as we want. Now, producers, on the other hand, at those lower prices, well, the law of supply tells us that at lower prices, suppliers aren't as interested in providing higher quantities. So this shortage is going to be our first complication as we're outside of our equilibrium. So when we have a quantity demanded greater than a quantity supplied, we have a shortage. This shortage is going to do something else. Since we are only supplying down here, we create what's called a deadweight loss, which is the area of this triangle here. You might also hear this referred to as unutilized gains from trade. This is not a beneficial situation. And what this actually does is a deadweight loss we should be producing here at Q star, but instead, since our price is too low, we're restricting our output and only producing at QS, quantity supplied. So all of these trades here, our demand curve is above our supply curve, which means that these trades would be mutually beneficial to both our consumers and our producers. However, since we're now restricted, these trades are not occurring. So what's going to happen to adjust this process when we have a shortage, which creates a deadweight loss? These prices need to be driven back up to our equilibrium market price. So to do this, buyers are going to compete with other buyers. So buyers compete with buyers. And our prices get driven up and restored back to equilibrium. So prices increase. This is referred to as a free market. And in free market, those with the highest willingness to pay are going to purchase, and those with the lowest costs are going to provide. So again, when we're outside of equilibrium, this competition and this natural balance is going to help drive our price points, which is going to be a price indicator for our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied. So this is our situation when we're priced below equilibrium. Let's take a look at what this will look like if we're priced above equilibrium. Again, we start with our supply and demand curve. Our vertical axis is price, horizontal on our quantity. We have a downward sloping demand curve, an upward sloping supply curve, which leads us towards our equilibrium where the two curves intersect. So we'll call this, again, we'll call this P star for price in equilibrium, and Q star for quantity in equilibrium. Now let's examine instead what would happen to our graph if we have a price above equilibrium. So I'm going to draw our increased price. We're going to call it P subscript A for above. We're going to read this the same way. So as we draw over, we first see that we intersect our demand curve here. So this becomes our quantity demanded, continuing this out to where we hit our supply curve, drop it down, and we get our quantity supplied, called QS. And the first thing we're going to see here is this is going to be a reverse situation of what we looked at before when our prices were below equilibrium. Now, our quantity demanded is less than our quantity supplied. The buyers at these higher prices, because of the law of demand, as prices increase, quantity demanded goes down. The buyers don't like this higher price point, so they're going to restrict their quantity consumption. The sellers, on the other hand, do like this new price point. They want to sell at higher prices. It increases their profits, so they're willing to supply a greater number of units. Now, in our opposite situation where we talked about a price below equilibrium, we saw a shortage. Now in this case, we're going to see a surplus. So this difference between our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied is going to lead to a surplus. The higher prices ensure that the suppliers are going to keep supplying, but again, this market signal isn't indicating correctly. So we're going to end up, rather than having a deadweight loss, we're going to be producing on this end of our graph. So we're going to end up with this area here of wasted resources. And this represents that additional inventory that's sitting in the warehouses and not really being utilized. Now, when we're on the right-hand side of this market equilibrium, anytime we have our supply curve above our demand curve, these are not beneficial trades. This is going to lead to a loss. So when we're outside of equilibrium here, we have our quantity demanded less than our quantity supplied, which leads to a surplus, which causes wasted resources. Now, to restore this equilibrium, what we're going to see is we're going to see now our sellers are going to compete with our other sellers, and the market price will be driven down. So sellers compete with sellers. And prices are driven down. This is going to be the general assumptions that we're going to be making with these models, and a general overview of equilibrium and its natural adjustment process in a free market. In the next video, we're going to look at what happens when we have exogenous factors that actually shift our supply and demand curve. And we'll see that when these curves shift, so too does their equilibrium points. Thank you for watching.